Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nicholas Jones. I'm the founder and director of Praxis. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, An Urgent Situation, Futures of Tourism. The first thing I'm going to mention is this is being recorded. And for any who aren't familiar with Praxis, we're an arts and culture catalyst based in Oslo, Norway. What we do is we create situations that help creative people develop their practices. Most often this is in connection with topics that practitioners feel important to them at this point in time. So this event is part of a larger project, An Urgent Situation, Rethinking Tourism Through Architecture, Art and Community, which is 3 phases. This first part is a series of 5 panel discussions, this one being the 4th of those. Then we'll have an online working group, and it should be followed by an in real life residency at Haven in Bali. So we hope that this talk series is setting a really strong foundation on which to build the wider project. And the plan for today's session is that each of our speakers is going to give a short presentation followed by discussion between the moderator and each other before opening up to questions from you, the audience. If at any point you have questions coming to mind, you can use the Q&A function, which should be found at the bottom right of the interface, to type in the questions, and then they'll come through to us and we will get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A session. So as we start, I'd like to say a special thanks to Charlotte Taylor, who's really led the way on this project, and to our collaborators, Rebel Architecture Lab, Don Lawrence Architects, artist Tanya Torgerson and Simone Haven. Rebel Architecture Labs, an Oslo-based not-for-profit collective working at the intersection of arts, architecture, urban intervention, and social science. Don Lawrence is an award-winning architect based in Oslo. Many of his projects focus on the potential for art and architecture to develop place. Artist Tanya Torgerson's practice has a strong focus on environment and knowledge systems, while Simone Haven is a socially responsible destination in the making that's going to prioritize culture, community, and conservation. So our moderator for today is David Cross. David's an artist and a reader at University of Arts in London. His research practice and teaching engage with social ecological crisis in relation to visual culture. Recognizing the conflict between his internationalism and environmentalism, he stopped using jet travel in 2005. In 2012, following the work of the Artist Placement Group, which sought to focus art outside of the gallery, predominantly by attaching artists to businesses, David designated his role at University of Arts London as becoming an artist placement, proposing that the university switch to an ethical bank. Together with his students, David then campaigned for the University of Arts London to divest almost £4 million of which it had in fossil fuel investments, which in 2015 they were successful in getting the university to pledge to do so. Since 2019, David's advocated for the University of the Arts London to integrate decarbonisation and decolonisation as a start towards regenerative ecology and restorative social justice. So I think it's safe to say that David brings some strong opinions to the discussion about the future of travel. And I would ask you to put your hands together and give a warm welcome to David and to the panel as I hand over to him to introduce the speakers. But unfortunately, in this format, we can't experience that. So instead, I'll simply say it's my pleasure to hand over to you, David. Oh, you're on mute at the moment, David.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. That's great. I wasn't expecting you to give the listeners any background on me, to be honest, but I really appreciate that you have. An Urgent Situation, Rethinking Tourism Through Architecture, Art and Community asks what the desirable futures of tourism might be, what's needed to realize those futures, and how creative people and creative methods might help. Speculative thinking is a creative method which explores interactions between factors and trends to envision possible futures and build routes towards the optimum situation. And today, the future is less than perfect. The post-Cold War era of economic growth based on globalized free trade has suffered a series of shocks. Conflict in the Middle East, displacement and migration of people, Trump, Brexit, In Britain, the pandemic and associated disruption of supply chains around the world have led some countries back into isolationist policies, and that could push other countries to do likewise. And then we have climate breakdown, intensifying and complicating these factors. To bring some structure to the way we might engage with that complexity, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has developed 5 scenarios for different degrees of global heating that the world could find itself in. And these scenarios are called shared socio-economic pathways. The third scenario, SSP3, has been titled Regional Rivalry, a Rocky Road. Very striking title, but what it describes is a situation marked by resurgent nationalism, a focus on economic competitiveness and security, and trade wars. Investments in education and technology decline in this scenario, undermining global development. Countries compete for fossil fuel supplies rather than cooperate on tackling the climate crisis. And this would lead to a global temperature rise of over 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Irreversible damage to the world's major cities, the collapse of the insurance industry, and severe food shortages would likely be the result of this situation. Though, of course, a minority of wealthy people would probably be able to protect themselves from the worst of the immediate effects. But take a breath, because a scenario is not a prediction. And the point is to imagine and build the best of possible futures. And that's why I'm delighted to join you today with Sophia Bazile, Andrew Holden, and Martha Thorne. Martha's going to be speaking first. She'll show us a presentation. And I'll just introduce her to you. She's Dean of the IE School of Architecture and Design within the innovative international private IE University in Spain. She served as Executive Director of the Pritzker Architecture Prize from 2005 to March 2021. Her main interests focus on 2 themes: the city of the future and innovation in architectural education. From 1995 to 2005, she worked as curator in Department of Architecture at the Art Institute of Chicago. She's written numerous articles for books and journals on contemporary architecture. She served on the board of directors of the International Archive of Women in Architecture and the Graham Foundation for Fine Arts. She has participated on juries for the new National Museum of Chinese Art, Zaradia Park in Moscow, and the Arc Vision Women and Architecture Prize, among many others. Ms. Thorne received a Master's of City Planning degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Urban Affairs from the State University of New York at Buffalo. She undertook additional studies at the London School of Economics. She's been elected an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects and of COAM, which is the Professional Association of Architects of Madrid. So I'm delighted that you're here with us today, Martha, and it would be great if you could share screen maybe and present to us your contribution.
Thank you so much, David. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and I'd like to extend my thanks as well to the organization, to Praxis, because it's a pleasure to be in dialogue about such an important subject. I'm coming to you, as you mentioned, from Madrid and IE School of Architecture and Design, where we try to approach education both deeply in our discipline, but also holistically and with a transdisciplinary focus to lend understanding to the issues at hand. And sustainable tourism is a subject that we've dealt with in our final projects for the professional architecture degree. However, I believe that the students were probably most concerned with the built and natural environments when they undertook their projects. And although we know that sustainability is a much broader encompassing social, cultural, and economic stability, we also know that it's increasingly complex to deal with all these issues effectively and equally, especially in tourism, where the ecosystem is highly competitive and complex. Today, in my brief remarks, I'd like to talk about the major challenges I see to sustainable tourism, and these occur both at macro and micro scales. I'd like to give a few brief ideas about directions for possible research and action for potential ways forward to make sure that tourism is viable and balanced in its multiple realms. Sustainable tourism is a form of tourism practice in destinations endeavoring to minimize the impact of conventional mass package tourism, and with a vision to decreasing the effects of tourist activities on the natural environment, but also decreasing the effect on the changes it could produce in the culture and local communities. But at the same time, sustainable tourism seeks to facilitate meaningful job creation for the residents. But if we look at sustainable tourism, I think we have to take a step back and ask, why do people travel? Well, without a doubt, there are many reasons why people travel, and often the sector is divided into business and leisure travel, but the buzzword that we hear so much nowadays is experience for the visitor. We know that tourists vary greatly in age and interests and home countries and budgets and wants and desires. But if we look at a painting such as this one by Delacroix, The Fanatics of Tangiers, which is a prime example of a response to neoclassical paintings, and it's in the Romantic style of the 19th century, we see that the emphasis here is on the personal emotion and the use of the word exotic or historically remote subject matters. Now, in this case, Delacroix did travel to Tangiers, but many proponents of Orientalism never set foot in those exotic places, North Africa or others. Yet they created paintings based on their imagination because they wanted to transport people from another place, often to a fictitious or an imaginary place. Now, were the motivations of Delacroix and the Orientalists so different from those of us today who want to go to Santa Claus Village near Rovaniemi, Finland? I read an article about this place, and the opening sentence was incredible. And I quote, it said, "Santa Claus Village is a true experience of living your favorite Christmas special. It's a place where you want to jump around like a child and sing Christmas carols with people you've never met before. It's a place that breathes the jolly spirit all year long, no matter what's going on in your life. It makes you appreciate the simple things." Isn't this mystification of a place? Now, we all know that tourism as it stands today is mostly an extractive industry. And by that, I mean that it's involved in the exploitation and production and use of non-renewable resources. It alters both the built and natural environments of the host communities. And sometimes, and many times, it also alters the culture, social structure of that community. The idea that temporary visitors can come in, use a place to take away an experience, photos, souvenirs. It can be likened to the mining industry, where the emphasis is on what you receive and take away, and not what is left behind nor what comes after you. Is it possible to go from an extractive industry to one in balance and one of stewardship? Or is it an oxymoron to think that to join sustainability and tourism together is impossible? Will sustainable tourism become the opportunity for the rich of the world who can afford to travel to luxurious places where few people and sustainability and environmental conservation are at the forefront? I'd like to share with you just one more example of tourism, and this is Lucy the Elephant. Lucy was constructed in New Jersey in the United States in 1881. the idea of James Lafferty, an inventor from Philadelphia. And Lucy was constructed of wood, is 6 stories tall and covered in tin sheeting. And the purpose, the original purpose of Lucy, was to attract real estate sales and attract tourists. Now, maybe you can imagine why I'm showing you Lucy, a sort of tongue-in-cheek, maybe even bad taste tourism. But it's something that has existed for more than 100 years and maybe can give us some insights and even lessons. But there's a second reason that I'm showing you Lucy. And that's because I think when it comes to tourism, there's an elephant in the room, or maybe several elephants. And those are the elephants that we somehow don't address, but they're there in all their large scale. And one big elephant in the room are national economies. Tourism is one of the biggest growing industries on earth. And even though COVID hit it very hard and in a significant way, it's trying to recover without really changing its structure or its goals. Today, or in 2019, about 1 in 10 jobs in the world were in the travel and tourism sector. And by 2029, it's projected that there will be about 421 million jobs. The number of tourists that are traveling has doubled in 10 years, more than doubled, about 528 million in 2005. And in 2015, it was already 1.2 billion. Now, if we drill down into the regions and national economies, we can see that some of the most fragile ecosystems in the world are islands in warm climates, where tourism can account for 3/4 of that country's gross domestic product. And although you can see here that COVID did hit the world unexpectedly and severely with a significant drop, it is recuperating and quickly. In countries such as Norway, tourism contributes about 9% to GDP. In my country of residence, Spain, it's about 15%, and it's the 3rd largest industry. In research studies and in academic articles, currently, visitors, by and large, do not put sustainability at the forefront of their goals for tourism. And as long as tourists do not demand this, or we can't convince them of a more holistic view of tourism, which goes beyond simply the purchase of an experience, I'm afraid we won't be able to obtain any sort of sustainable goals. So what is our hope? Well, I'll come back to Lucy in a second, but one of our hopes may be, surprisingly, 2.9 million Airbnb hosts in the world, with over 7 million Airbnb listings worldwide. And perhaps this group, while not as homogeneous like any company or a large hotel chain or other transportation companies, it's amazing because in 10 years, with few employees, it's had an enormous impact on the travel industry and following a model of the shared economy. If it were possible to see this as an alternative, not only to traditional accommodations, but to make the goals of sustainable development part of that experience and a requirement, just think of the power of this industry and this company. The second hope that I have is in terms of legislation and policy and pressure on the industry. We know that long-term viability depends on change. Otherwise, the tourism industry will not exist in the future. But this means modifying policies, criteria, and goals. And to provoke change, we're faced with the big job of stakeholders. They have to realign their expectations, advise investors in the companies, the need to be transparent and more responsible. It's difficult to ask for a long-term view when so many aspects of the industry rely on short-term, immediate gratification, and there's a disconnect between the goals and objectives. And finally, for my own field, which is education, we need to bring new knowledge, new goals, new tools, and impart realistic, measurable steps to all our students in fields that touch the tourism sector, from architecture to real estate, from economics to international policy. Short-term measures we take now have to do with controlling the capacity of destinations, promoting educational tourism or work-related tourism, which we see a visitor as more a long-term resident who is there not only for personal goals, but becomes part of the community. Artists in residence programs or faculty exchanges or international student programs have been doing this for a long time. Increasingly, there are types of tourism where volunteers can work on local projects that are needed by a community in exchange for the experience of a faraway place where they are able to have more meaningful and respectful contact with the host community. So let's go back to Lucy. And while you may say that this is the kitschiest type of tourism that exists, and some may say it is gimmicky or crass, we can't approach tourism from an elitist point of view or dictate taste. We therefore have to concentrate on the potential impacts and how to mitigate the negative effects. Lucy still exists, and in the first part of the 20th century served as a restaurant, business office, tavern. And although called the Elephant Hotel, the building was not made into a hotel until recently. Lucy was refurbished in the 60s and 70s, and in 2020, in February of this year, Airbnb offered you to sleep inside one of the 6 stories for a whopping $438 a night. Once again, Lucy is undergoing refurbishment because of her damaged skin. So is Lucy sustainable tourism? Well, she's a long-term, adaptable structure integrated into the local culture and memory of many people. She does her job of attracting people to the local economy, but not too many and not too often. She doesn't use a lot of resources or modify the surroundings. She is an authentic experience, although maybe not the taste of all of us. And I think finally, Lucy may be able to impart a good lesson in history, and she certainly makes you smile. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martha. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
We don't have any questions in the chat so far, but if you have questions forming in your mind, do please note them down, because what I find is that quite often as the flow of thoughts progresses, I might lose or let slip the formulation of a question which seemed absolutely clear at the time. So make a note if you've got questions for Martha, and we can return to those in due course in the overall discussion after all 3 presentations have been heard. Well, next we're going to move to Dr. Andrew Holden, who is Professor of Environment and Tourism at the Institute for Creative and Cultural Entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths, University of London. A graduate in environmental sciences, his doctorate studies researched the relationship between sustainable development and recreation in the Cairngorm Mountains of Scotland in Britain. He has subsequently worked in several countries around the world, assessing how tourism can be used to encourage sustainable development and environmental entrepreneurship. His books, published by Routledge, include Environment and Tourism and Tourism, Poverty and Development. Andrew understands tourism as an activity located at the human-environment interface, and he favours multidisciplinary and multi-experienced approaches in the creation of ideas to make tourism a dynamic of sustainable change. So I'm delighted to welcome Andrew, and if you've got a presentation you'd like to share with us, Andrew, maybe you could use the share screen function.
Okay, thank you, David. Yeah, I'll go to that now. Share screen, and hopefully
all good.
Yeah, all good.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to begin by saying thank you to Nicholas and Charlotte for arranging this series. I think it's very exciting. It's great to have the space to bring people together with different backgrounds and different ideas to discuss what is a very important subject as we go through this century. And thank you also, David, for chairing this and doing the introductions. So really what I would like to do today is to really just focus upon what I would like tourism to be doing in the next few decades, where I see it as a tool for social and human development. So really these are my ideas, my kind of vision of what I would like it to be in a utopia, if you like. So moving on, and there's a yurt that I stayed in very recently, which was on the Scottish borders. Actually, it was very, very comfortable, kind of what was called glamping, but a very lovely tourist experience integrated into a farm where it was very, very environmentally sustainable organic practices that were being pursued in this farm. And of course, this is a niche of tourism, but it's an illustration of the diversity that exists in the marketplace. So just to sort of present a context to this presentation, I think we're at a juncture in society. Tourism has become very much a mainstream feature of society, particularly Western societies, and into a globalizing consumer society, where people expect holidays. It's become a need and necessity of lifestyle, and people think, or perhaps don't reflect perhaps enough, but they expect the week's holiday or the 2 weeks holiday. And I think we probably need to be at a place of reformulating the meaning and purpose of tourism in terms of what we want it to do in the Anthropocene. And I'm using that term, the Anthropocene, because the general framing of this whole debate relates to aspects of sustainability, and obviously environment is a key part of that, the surroundings. And there's no doubt that human actions are very much changing the climate, as David talked about in the introduction. So moving on to where does tourism's role come into this? So what's tourism's role in this global ecological crisis? And, you know, I call it an ecological crisis. It's a social ecological crisis. I mean, the roots of the ecological crisis lay in very much the human action and how we value the environment or how we don't value it, and the actions that we take around that valuation, how we consume resources individually, collectively. These are issues that are obviously very pertinent to the whole aspect of society at the beginning of the 21st century. And to what role can technology deal with those problems? Or will it rely upon us having a reevaluation of our relationship to nature, our place in nature, and our lifestyles, of which tourism has become an integral part? So, as Martha was saying, there has been an exponential increase in tourist numbers in recent decades. If you go back to 1950, there was about 25 million international travellers. Before the pandemic in 2019, that had risen to 1.4 billion. And it is this massive increase in mobility that is raising issues about tourism as this kind of activity that is purely fun-based, hedonistic, which seems to be the real mainstream view of it in recent decades, probably up to the last 2 or 3 decades, when ethical questions about its impacts on local communities, on nature, have very seriously been raised. But the extent that that has fed into the marketplace, you know, is mixed. And IATA, the International Air Transport Association, in terms of their predictions for air travel, the predictions are that the numbers of air travellers will rise to about 7.2 billion by 2035. And that compares to 3.8 billion in 2016. So almost a doubling by 2035. Admittedly, these figures were done the year before the pandemic, so the pandemic will slow that down a bit. But nevertheless, the growth globally is absolutely extraordinary potential growth. And that growth is primarily in China, it's in America, it's in India, and Vietnam and Cambodia were the primary growth markets in terms of real numbers. Percentage-wise, where was the percentage growth going to be in air travel in the future? Countries in Africa. But it suggests that in less than 20 years, we could have a doubling of international passengers using planes. So it's very popular. It's spreading across global society, and this is the real big issue about dealing with the numbers and the incremental and cumulative impacts on resources, on societies, on destinations. So the big issue globally, of course, is mobility, which are very carbon-centric, a very heavy reliance on aviation, which unfortunately, in terms of technical solutions, is probably the sector that is most far behind any other sector in dealing with climate change. If you look at housing, you look at industry, you look at mobility related to cars, advancements are being made there technologically. For aviation, it's a long, long way behind, which probably may come up in the panel discussion. And these issues of over-tourism play out in places like Venice, which I was there a couple of years ago. The type of experience that you have as a tourist, for me, was not a great one, surely because of the pressure of numbers. And of course, for local people, although the economy is very heavily dependent, in terms of the enjoyment of their place, it must raise big issues. And of course, over-tourism has led to protests in places like Barcelona, Amsterdam, and other localities against the numbers of tourists. There's tremendous influx that's taken place in the last couple of decades. And an issue of that is that's partly fueled by Airbnb, which, as we put forward as a solution, can also be a problem, because people buying properties to rent out as Airbnb places, removing them from use by local people and the local community. So there's a lot of tourism, which I see as a double-edged sword. And one solution can very often create problems. And again, if we look at a typical Mediterranean resort, I think most of us would probably judge that as a case of over-tourism, just in terms of our psychological capacity to deal with being with people. Yet this is a model that has developed in many places, including the Caribbean and Mediterranean in certain places. So this raises key issues. Another aspect is about global urbanization in society. We're rapidly moving to a globally urbanized society. It was about 5-6 years ago that ratio passed globally in terms of over 50% of the world's population living in urban areas. And that creates a desire for recontact with nature. That's been shown historically since the creation of the American national parks in the 19th century, right through different societies as they've urbanized. There is a desire to get away from those urban areas and recreate to nature. This offers a tremendous potential for tourism, but of course it also puts great pressure on the natural resources of tourism. But at a time when environmental resources are disappearing, or ecosystems of biodiversity are being put under pressure generally, it gives a scarcity value to many of these different aspects of nature. So the overuse of these nature's resources, environmental limits, and socioeconomic and cultural inequalities are all bound into the model of trying to create a model of sustainable tourism, about how we actually deal with that at different spatial levels, both globally and within destinations. And the behavioural responses of how people respond to these different issues as well is interesting, because we have growth markets, so trends. One is in well-being tourism, the idea of people going away to enhance their well-being, which has always been really historically integral to tourism. That's always been practiced in terms of people getting away from urban areas for health reasons, whether it was to mountains or the coast or whatever. But it's a growth market, again, very often associated with escaping social media and the pressures of life today. Yeah, on the other hand, we have the Instagram and social media trend, which is very much orientated to particularly young people. You know, they're very influenced in terms of where they travel by Instagram, hashtag Venice, hashtag beautiful location in nature, which again has created problems of over-visitation and about the role of image in tourism, which is very, very important across the board. And also LCT, which is last chance tourism. So another trend has been for people to try and get to the Arctic before it melts. There's been a tremendous growth, for example, in Arctic tourism because of the disappearance of the sea ice, the thinning out of it because of climate change. And people want to go to places like the Arctic or to glaciers to actually see them before they disappear. Yet, of course, in the same process, are contributing to the problem through the mobility, whether it's by traveling by air on cruise ships or whatever. So it's complex. What I'm trying to say is a lot of complexity in trying to deal with the problems of tourism and behavioural aspects of how individuals respond to the general climate change scenario and the changing political economy in the world is very, very important in determining how tourism will play out into the future. So lastly, just to move on to what I would like my vision of tourism to be. So my dream, if you like, is about tourism reshaping society in a very positive way, achieving carbon neutral goals, moving to net zero. Tourism, how do we do that with the mobility issue? It's a big, big question. At destination levels, it's going to be easier to achieve that. At the spatial level of moving people around, it's going to be a much bigger challenge. Biodiversity conservation and ecosystem health, making a contribution to that by giving an economic value to nature. People going to see it gives it an economic value, which can present as an argument for conservation against other development options that may be more damaging to it. There's a case in the Mabera rainforest in Uganda in Africa, where one of the most rich ecosystems there was being put under pressure from removal for actually production of alternative fuel, sugarcane for ethanol. And this is again another illustration. Tourism stopped that because of the value of ecotourism in it. But nevertheless, it's a sort of an interesting dilemma that by moving, for example, to sustainable fuels for aviation, we could actually be reducing the biodiversity on the planet because of the land use requirements to grow that. So it shows the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with. Poverty reduction, of course, is really important part of tourism, and climate justice and community resilience I see as very essential elements. So quickly moving on. So what we want there, or what I'm thinking about here, is the ethical choice that people make in terms of integrating tourism into a sustainable lifestyle and balancing the interests of the collective with the individual. So an enhanced awareness of the outcomes of tourism, of making that individual trip, and what are the consequences for the global society of that. So I think a reevaluation of tourism as a need is almost becoming, as I said at the beginning, integrated into consumer lifestyles as an expectation and need. We have to get away. We have to have this rupture with everyday life. We need the dreams and the escapism that are sold into the tourism market as part of the consumerism. And that may raise moral issues, which it already has. So fleek scam in flight shame in, forgive my pronunciation of that, but hopefully it's approximately correct. But the flight shame issue that's arisen in Scandinavia and Greta Thunberg, you know, has been very instrumental in sort of driving that forward. But is it morally acceptable to just take as many flights as we want without really thinking about the purpose of those flights and how we use aviation? We also got the issue of strengthening environmental literacy and connections between people and nature. People visit nature and the environment, it offers an opportunity to actually connect people, make people aware of environmental values inherent in nature and the spirituality of it. I would hope that tourism could play a lead in creating a green economy and poverty reduction. And I see this as an important part of it in a destination level, and particularly the use of Indigenous knowledge in things like dealing with environmental problems, and also obviously in terms of architecture and that kind of development of hotels, because hotels are great resource users and accommodation in other areas. So how can Indigenous knowledge be put into that is really critical. And obviously the exchange platforms, was illustrated last week actually, in terms of the use of local culture and tourism together. And another aspect that I think we have to think about is in the reconstruction of tourism, along with arts, and is, you know, the influence of the artificial intelligence and robotics, where that may take us in the next 20 to 30 years, about the recreation of experiences in the home and the need to travel, and how that's going to complement the mobility of the tourism market, and can it supply the authenticity of place that you get from being a tourist. These are kinds of issues that I see as being critical to the future. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Wow, well, thank you for that, Andrew. That's you've outlined a number of really important counterpointing forces in a way, which interact in a set of maybe feedback loops. The desire to get away is partly because of the kind of cities we've created, which perhaps give people too much encounter with each other, too much noise and stress and pressure to produce, and that corresponds to the pressure to consume and escape. And so we're in a kind of dynamic feedback loop, really, where the sort of vicious cycle perpetuates itself. But it's really helpful that you've identified some of the coordinates that might help us navigate our way out of this. But I'd like to move now, though, to Sophia Bazile. Sophia is a certified Foresight practitioner, an ICF-trained coach, cultural consultant, curator, learning and development specialist, perpetual seeker, learner, companion and guide on journeys of individual and collective inquiry. She's partnered with impact-driven individuals, institutions and organizations across diverse areas of interest in industry, and her work is committed to raising awareness and building capacities around futures and foresight, particularly among underrepresented and traditionally excluded and marginalized communities. Sophia works with forward thinkers to flip the script, as she put it, which means leveraging powerful narratives to actualize the most audacious ambitions. Approaching with a sense of optimistic urgency and profound agency, she sees as a dance, one where calibrating curiosity and catalyzing courage meet. As a first-generation Haitian, USian, I need to learn this new term, who has lived in Latin America, the Middle East, China, and now Southeast Asia, Sophia's life work is enriched and inspired by colorful encounters and connection. The power in recognition and remembering of place, people, and potential liberates infinite possibilities for her. She's currently enjoying numerous futures-focused roles, partnerships, and projects in transdisciplinary approaches to world building for inclusivity, empowerment, flourishing, and equity. Otherwise, she's podcasting, reading, and writing, but then dancing and going on scooter-led adventures, humbly taking in the vast and expansive beauty of Bali. I'm absolutely delighted that you've been able to join us today, Sophia. That's a fascinating life world you've sketched out for us. And apparently you refuse to give us any spoilers, but you might be telling us a story.
Well, clearly I like storytelling, so I'm going to try a different approach. You all get a treat from me today because I forgot to cancel 30-day trial of script. So I've been indulging in audiobooks, and I was laying there reading this, well, actually listening to the first time of this book that used to be my favorite. So it's going to be about 4 or 5 minutes, but I want you to think about, as I'm reading to you, how many ways can you connect this excerpt to tourism? And why am I sharing this with you? So, we have to be prepared for change, he thought, and he was grateful for the jacket's weight and warmth. The jacket had a purpose, and so did the boy. His purpose in life was to travel. And after 2 years of walking the Andalusian terrain, he knew all the cities of the region. He was planning on this visit to explain to the girl how it was that a simple shepherd knew how to read, that he had attended a seminary until he was 16. His parents had wanted him to become a priest, and thereby a source of pride for a simple farm family. They worked hard just to have food and water like the sheep. He had studied Latin, Spanish, and theology, but ever since he had been a child, he had wanted to know the world, and this was much more important to him than knowing God and learning about man's sins. One afternoon, on a visit to his family, he had summoned up the courage to tell his father that he didn't want to become a priest, that he wanted to travel. People from all over the world have passed through this village, son, said his father. They come in search of new things, but when they leave, they are basically the same people they were when they arrived. They climb the mountain to see the castle, and they wind up thinking that the past was better than what we have now. They have blonde hair or dark skin, but basically they're the same as the people who live right here. But I'd like to see the castles and the towns where they live, the boy explained. Those people, when they see our land, say that they would like to live here forever, his father continued. Well, I'd like to see their land and see how they live, said his son. His father said no more. The next day, he gave his son a pouch that held 3 ancient Spanish golden coins. I'd like to be a shepherd. I found these one day in the fields, and I wanted them to be a part of your inheritance, but use them to buy your flock. Take to the fields, and someday you'll learn that our countryside is the best, and our women are the most beautiful. And he gave the boy his blessing. The boy could see in his father's gaze a desire to be able himself to travel the world, a desire that was still alive, despite his father's having had to bury it over dozens of years under the burden of struggling for water to drink, food to eat, and the same place to sleep every night of his life. The horizon was tinged with red, and suddenly the sun appeared. The boy thought back to that conversation with his father and felt happy. He had already seen many castles and met many women, but none the equal of the one who awaited him several days hence. He owned a jacket, a book that he could trade for another, and a flock of sheep. But most important, he was able every day to live out his dream. If he were to tire of the Andalusian fields, he could sell his sheep and go to sea. By the time he had had enough of the sea, he would already have known other cities, other women, and other chances to be happy. I couldn't have found God in the seminary, he thought, as he looked at the sunrise. Whenever he could, he sought out a new road to travel. He had never been to that ruined church before, in spite of having traveled through those parts many times. The world was huge and inexhaustible. He had only to allow his sheep to set the route for a while, and he would discover other interesting things. The problem is that they don't even realize that they're walking a new road every day. They don't see that the fields are new and the seasons change. All they think about is food and water. Maybe we're all that way, the boy mused. Even me. I haven't thought of other women since I met the merchant's daughter. Looking at the sun, he calculated that he would reach Tarifa before midday. There, he could exchange his book for a thicker one, fill his wine bottle, shave, and have a haircut. He had to prepare himself for his meeting with the girl, and he didn't want to think about the possibility that some other shepherd with a larger flock of sheep had arrived there before him and asked for her hand. It's the possibility of having a dream come true that makes life interesting, he thought, as he looked again at the position of the sun and hurried his pace. He then suddenly remembered that in Tarifa, there was an old woman who interpreted dreams. So that's my excerpt. Let's see a hand from people I can see, the panelists, if you know which story that is.
I don't recognize it, but that was wonderful. And it flipped the world, as you say, flipped the script by proposing this counter visit. Why is tourism one way? Can it not be a two-way exchange? I think that's a brilliant and clear proposition.
So I love that story. That's The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. He's a very prolific far from British. He's a Brazilian author who's written many, many books. But this is by far his most famous. And I used to gift this to my students when I taught humanities every year. And everybody knows it as the book about chasing your dreams. And I only happened upon it randomly because I couldn't figure out what to listen to or read the other day. And as I was laying there in bed, I was like, wow, this is perfect. Because at the heart of talking about tourism is that we need to flip the script on what that word even means. We have such a narrow definition of what tourism is, yet wasn't Santiago the shepherd also a tourist? He's taking his flock of sheep and he goes to a church and he enjoys the sights. He visits cafes, he visits bookstores. Tourism is a sector that impacts every single other thing in every geographic location that it really happens. From retail to hospitality, because sometimes people conflate hospitality and tourism as one and the same, that is not. And you name it, travel, obviously. And thank you so much for Martha and Andrew for giving us a very rich and insightful look at many of the things that we know about over tourism and lots of other sustainability issues. So I'll just share my screen. And I thought how I would introduce myself is first through a story, because it's about narratives and what narratives we share or narratives that we don't share that are going to drive changes that we need to see in this world. So excuse me for a moment. I just need the right window because I had it just a moment ago. And if I just present and I will share my screen. So I think you should be able to see that. Okay, so yes. Oh, back. So yeah, that was The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. He made it all the way to the Egyptian pyramids. And when reframing and reimagining tourism, this is the Sagrada Familia. He didn't make it there because it wasn't built yet when this story was set, which was in the early 1800s. But he very much would have enjoyed visiting that church, although his primary, he used shepherding as a means to travel. So the fact that we are very, very fixed on our ideas of what tourism are, and we haven't been able to expand that and pick up on nuance and pick up on the different reasons that why people travel are some things that I hope to really look at. Now, what I want to do today, actually, because you all gave such amazing factual and data-driven information, is just talk about what I do. What is futures literacy? Because this could be something that is actually new for a lot of people. Futures literacy, and this is just a UNESCO definition, it's the skill that allows people to better understand the role that the future plays in what they see and do. So what are our images of the future? And how did they get there? Where did they even come from? What are the assumptions and biases that are underneath the surface that drive the actions we make today that continue to perpetuate the futures that we, in this case, don't want in terms of sustainability and tourism? So as a result of becoming more futures literate, humans are able to learn to imagine the future for different reasons and in different ways. So futures literacy is becoming more literate, and it's a profoundly important skill. It was one that turned my life upside down 2 years ago when I was first introduced to it at the Asia Pacific Futures Network. Now, other areas of study that are related: future studies, foresight, strategic foresight, anticipatory studies, complexity studies, and are all adjacently related to this. So I have done some work in the futures of tourism, not that much, but this particular intrigue, besides my love of traveling, really happened when I moved here strategically from Bangkok to Bali in March 2020. I came just as the pandemic situation was escalating. I happened to work with a very Elon Musk-y type of person who knew all about these things, and decided that coming to Bali with 17,000 islands, lots of food, lots of nice people, fresh fruit would be an amazing, well, yes, it's been amazing. And it's been a sanctuary but it was a good strategic decision to come here at the height of at the beginning of the pandemic. So when I arrived though, and I just remember the feeling that I had walking down the streets of Seminyak, and there were people, and I liken this to watching that scene in the Titanic where they're all playing as the ship is sinking, just Balinese people, food and hospitality people, hoteliers standing there, doors wide open, music pumping, just waiting for people that were never going to come. And my heart broke because nobody anticipated just what was going to happen. And this is what kicked off my intrigue. So I did a presentation at APFN 2019 called, the theme was Regenerating Asia 2050. And it was about Awakening Bali 2050, Restoring the Heart of the Island. I approached it from a spiritual lens, but also there was tourism elements in there as well. But that's because I define tourism a little bit differently. So yes, just some nice pictures of Bali. And it's the most Instagrammable travel location, as you know. And so here we looked at, there was a lot of chaos and uncertainty in November 2019. Or was that 2020? No, November 2019, because 2021. Okay, yeah, there was a ton of chaos and uncertainty. It was pandemic, these conflicting narratives. And I was watching as people who are not native to here and their ideas about what was going on with COVID-19 began to permeate local context and local conversations. So that was very interesting to watch to unfold. And lots of people say when you, they're tired of tourism and traveling because when you go somewhere, everything's starting to look the same. So when you come to Bali, there's lots of interesting architecture and interesting places, but the cafes you could find about just about anywhere in the world. And there used to be a lot more, adherence to tradition in terms of architecture, but lately you're seeing very, very modern paper cookie cutter villas popping up everywhere. Land is being sold off in droves still. And honestly, though there were some signals of pausing and reflecting and taking an opportunity to renew or reimagine tourism, it's very much split that they're building back better means more, means more tourists, more villas, more hotels, and therefore more extraction of resources, less sustainable. There's not a strong forward vision here, and there's a lot of division on what tourism should look like. So yes, and people come to Bali for spiritual practices. So it's so important to consider culture and consider context when we are talking about tourism, right? These are the ways that we really are able to mediate conflict or navigate very difficult conversations by meeting people where they are. So in Bali, it's Trihita Karana, which is the three pillars of their Balinese Hinduism, which is the most important part of their life, right? It's love for God, love for nature, love for humans. So what does that look like in having that, not just in theory and in daily practices and rituals, but actually having it reciprocated or replicated in other parts of their development, right? Now, I will also say that, as you most likely know, Bali is the Balinese Hindus are a minority in a Muslim majority country. So a lot of what they face, although tourism provides a huge contribution to the GDP of Indonesia overall, they still are always at odds with the Indonesian government about how to move things forward. So not only are there, differing discussions on the island between different families, banjars, areas, regions, but also in the context of Indonesia as a whole and how they deal with a Muslim majority country and the ideals about who comes to Bali and what they do here. Just a couple of, on October, like 2 weeks ago, actually, it was the 19th year anniversary of the Bali Bombings. So those of us from the West tend to forget that these places are still politically volatile, yes? So about 200 people were killed in a main nightlife district in Bali. Now that's a distant memory for many people, or it's not a memory at all because of social media, and imagine how that's exponentially influenced what Bali is seen as. So there's lots of fascinating intersections, collisions, and meshing of different aspects of how we could think about tourism. Then next, I had the pleasure of co-directing the Asia Pacific Futures Network conference, and we had an amazing discussion between some really wonderful people. That's why it's interesting for me to be here in this seat, because I'm not necessarily a tourism expert. However, I loved being in the position to create a panel of people talking about tourism in Asia and the Pacific who are diverse, who are women, and who are representing very different backgrounds, but there's one futurist there, Dr. Michael McCallum, but these other people are human geographers, and they are, she's the CEO of PATA, the Pacific Asia Travel Association, and these are people who really, really understand the interacting system dynamics and the complexities of tourism from different angles.
Sophia, you've raised some fascinating points of interest here, which is so relevant, and particularly your narrative approach, talking about the underlying values and, in a way, the cultural myths that drive people's desire to travel.
Am I still sharing? Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
So that was fantastic and really stimulating and completely relevant as a contribution to what we're talking about here, which on the one hand is practical challenges we face, real logistical obstacles, emerging opportunities, but how we respond to these, I think, is very much a question of our sense of self, whatever position we might have in the world. And I particularly liked your idea of flipping the script and reversing things around, the kind of disruption to the anticipated framing of a story. But what I'd like to do, if I may, would be to open this up a little bit and to address a question to Martha, who I know is under time pressure today. But we have a question from Nicholas, which was specifically for you, Martha, saying that he's very interested in your background of deep engagement in the architectural field. And you talked about ideals in tourism. So while Sophia has referred to narratives and Andrew has identified a whole range of different ethical dilemmas around the concept of sustainable tourism, the notion of ideals in tourism, which you talked about, is including stewardship and balanced relationship with local community. So could you say a little bit about some of the best examples of architecture for tourism and how they function in relation to this ideal of stewardship?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Andrew and Sophie. And I can't wait to have a long conversation at some time in the future, because there's so many subjects that have been opened up here. You know, I think the architecture field is one a particularly difficult one, because it often responds to a client. And therefore, to have a more entrepreneurial or innovative way of looking at things is not always easy. But I do think there are examples of stewardship, and I could cite, for example, an architect, Anna Heringer, who has worked in many communities and sees, while she is an architect, she does rely a lot on things Andrew said, on the local culture, local ways of building. She also sees that her work in these places is architecture as employment. So it's where she maybe use technology at times. It's very much something where she encourages the local people to use their craft to preserve it and to be a source of environment. Now, some of the structures she does and has worked on in places are for housing. Other ones are for tourism. But I think the idea of stewardship, as Sophia has provoked us, architecture and stewardship could be very local. Why not in a community create more open space? Why not have tourism rather than us going en masse to Venice on a cruise ship? Why can't we discover the other side of the city? Why can't we discover the new building that went up or the old building that was refurbished in our own town. So I think that stewardship, it's a very difficult thing. It needs a mindset change. But I do like the idea of eliminating that need for a long distance because people really use that to talk about where they were rather than what they experienced, and to use architecture to create enriching, fulfilling experiences even close to home.
That's fascinating. The idea of stewardship as a kind of diligent interaction with the material world, a kind of cultivation rather than an extractive model, I think is absolutely crucial to the difference between possession and ownership, for example, that we inhabit the world. We delude ourselves to think that it's a piece of property or a piece of merchandise in a way. I think the ecosystem rebels against that and is starting to show through. But underlying that, I want to return and connect that back to what Sophia was saying about flipping the script. The idea of a script as being something written before us, which we simply read or perform in some way, or whether the script is a piece of code, like an algorithm that we follow. And by flipping and reversing that, the very assumption that that can be done shows in a way that we can start to interrogate the meta-narratives, these deep assumptions driving modernity, for example. The idea of progress and development is in a way aligned with the idea of personal growth. And so the idea that wealthy people would be able to travel to the interesting and exotic poorer nations of the world so they could experience something outside the industrial cities of wealth creation and extraction where they come from, as Andrew pointed out, I think flipping that around is a really challenging thing to do. Like, why can't we imagine a world in which the people of Africa can come and visit the wealthy centers of the world, which have become rich through so many centuries of a one-way form of exchange? So flipping the script, Sophia, I think is a really valuable thing to do. And aligning that with the idea of questioning escape and promoting the idea of stewardship, I think works together in a really productive way. Andrew, Nicholas wanted to know, he said, you said that the travel sector is behind on addressing its climate impact. And you did particularly focus on jet travel, which I would imagine is a massive part of the actual way that people reach their dream destination is through the kind of banal system of international air travel. It has to be done, I guess. But in contrast to the dream of carbon neutral goals in tourism, can you imagine what it would take to develop, like, how would we actually move people around if it's not going to be in jet travel and the jet engine can't be improved fast enough in the time available? What would it take to have carbon neutral travel? How do you think it might be achieved?
It's a really big question, but I think realistically you would have to be looking at very different spatial flows of tourism than we have at the present. Certainly, if you're talking about the mobility of tourism and trying to make that carbon neutral or zero carbon, then there are ways that that can be done in the next 20 years for certain length of journeys. Obviously, things like train travel, for example, electric cars, the idea, even planes, there will be short-haul electric battery use of planes for limited journeys between cities, probably in the next 10, 15 years. Already in British Columbia, the water-based planes that they have there to travel around the coast of British Columbia, they're already trialing battery-powered planes. And they have been successful for very short trips of 20 minutes carrying 10 people or whatever. They've got that capacity to do it. So I think we're talking about a type of tourism where we couldn't have the same amount of spatial coverage of distance. And the tourism would be the travel element would be shorter than it is. So for example, crossing the Atlantic, maybe something that has to be restricted in terms of the amount of that travel if we want to have a carbon neutral tourism system. where mobility is increasingly zero carbon, because I think the zero carbon aspect is only going to be possible over fairly short travel distances, and not necessarily to the same degree. So then we got to start looking at other things, because at the same time, we've got to balance all of this with the need for tourism to create jobs in places like Bali, for example, for the need for international tourism to Bali. Certainly, if you're looking at the creative ideas, then you could be looking at which markets, if you were thinking about targeting advertising Bali as a destination, which markets within Southeast Asia have high growth, high economic growth. There's plenty of them. Do tourists need to be coming from the West so much, or can they be coming from other closer countries where you're reducing the impact of carbon release through mobility? You can be looking at the growth of domestic tourism, which again helps to reduce the carbon footprint of mobility associated with people going to a particular destination. So you've got to be quite creative. I think it's about trying to address the issue of what people want from tourism, where they need to go to get that. I think Martha was saying about the symbolism of tourism, you know, about having been there rather than the experience of actually what it's like in that destination. So it is about the experiences that people are getting from travel. And I think that's what Sophia's story was alluding to as well, about, you know, looking at what is around your home compared to this innate desire that we seem to have to travel further and further to find what we actually want. And whilst curiosity will always fuel tourism, it is about addressing what we actually get through tourism. And certainly in countries where there has been a lot of it, so we're talking here about the developed countries, there's sort of the post-tourism syndrome set in, where people are beginning to question about the hassle of that travel, and particularly since the pandemic, about the amount of palaver you have to go through to actually travel. And whether that's really worth it in terms of what they get out of it. But of course, there are big regions of the world where people have had no chance to travel internationally before. And this is a really big issue about the future of zero carbon in tourism, because the big markets, as I said, you know, for travel are going to be China, they're going to be, it's going to be Vietnam, it's going to be Cambodia, it's going to be the African countries. People there, of course, they want the same experiences that many people have had in the West, to actually travel to these different destinations. So it's not an easy one, David, basically, but that's the way I would see it. I would see that the short haul travel, the future use of technology where it's available in terms of electric cars, electric planes, example, trains, will all help reduce that. But it does need a rethinking through also about where destinations target their markets, where they want people to come from, to reducing that carbon footprint.
Well, I think that's fascinating, because what you've got here is a series of propositions you've outlined, or principles for driving the changes that might be made, about how we can modify and reduce the impact of tourism, whilst expecting that with a growing number of people from emerging economies, or what you might characterize as the global South, have easily an equal right to travel as those from the wealthy West. But then when we come into the numbers side of it, like the sheer number of people who want to go and explore and travel the world, the concept of the global carbon budget is extremely useful, because it says actually the Western scientific paradigm shows us that there's a limit to how much carbon we can put in the atmosphere before we trigger runaway climate change. And if it isn't possible to change jet travel fast enough, we can't bring on board electric engines or bullet trains around the planet. We can't actually cope with the demand for travel that seems to be not just unsustainable, but growing. Then we face a kind of sharper edge to the ethical question of who gets to travel. And that's what I really liked about Sophia's point here about flipping the script. If we imagine that a person might see their purpose in life as being to see the world, to advance and develop by experiencing different places and different people, we're in a crunch situation. There isn't any more room left in the atmosphere. The wealthy developed the world since the Industrial Revolution has used up the carbon budget. And now there's a great surge of people who want to enjoy similar benefits of a prosperous lifestyle. So it can't all happen. And so then we got really hard ethical choices about who gets to do the travel, given that we are where we are with the technologies we've got and the limited time. And so to take it back to the deep stories that Sophia touched on, I think might be a really useful thing to do. Like, who do we see ourselves as? And what is this process of self-actualization that we think moving around the planet is going to help us realize? And I think that's a really important thing, the meta-narrative, the kind of cultural stories that within which we play out the script of our lives, if you will. So Sophia, have you got any particular sense of that as a sense of global justice? I'm very involved in climate justice as a discourse. And the question there, not just who gets to travel, but who gets to decide who gets to travel. And I wonder whether you have a view on that.
Well, here's my take on it. I think that part of the reason why we are stuck in this narrative about tourism is because we are calling it tourism over and over again. And it's so much more than that. And it's so much more nuanced than that. I'm going to use an example for, allow me to use an example. When I started living abroad, I was an expat. But then when you unpack that, what makes me, who moves from a country to country for work, why am I not a migrant worker? Well, my skin is the right color to be called that, but I actually have a US passport. So when we call things tourism, we're automatically perpetuating this narrative that it's reserved for a few people. But if we begin to change our language and talk about travel and think about why people move and what they do, what pulls them towards places, what pushes them towards new places, looking at it at a very meta level is super important, right? Why do people, and we're all going to be forced to move at some point with climate change, yes? So going back to your comment about why can't African people go visit global north cities? Well, actually, I don't think that's something that the wealthy countries are well, they're already actually experiencing it. Immigration, people are moving into those areas, and this is prompting the nationalism, the closed borders, and the xenophobia. Yet this is going to continue to happen, right? People are going to move in different directions because of what's happening along the earth. So whether they like it or not, there's going to be Africans in northern and Western countries, and they're going to be wanting to do tourism. They're also going to be wanting to work, and their children are also going to be wanting to be educated. So, for example, I'm sitting in Bali right now, and many of the hotels and the establishments here, we've been here for over a year and a half, some longer. They've converted to long-term stays now, monthly stays, and I'm sitting in a hotel that also has a co-working space and a swimming pool and a gym. Why can't we start thinking about repurposing spaces more intentionally that are going to meet the needs of people who travel for many, many different reasons? The primary reason might be work. When you go to a conference in a different city, you go to the conference. But when you're not at the conference, you go to the museum, you go out to dinner, you go do all the other touristy things. I've lived in places where I'm a tourist forever because I haven't seen everything in that city. So this very narrow definition of tourism is part of the issue that keeps perpetuating these things. Now, on the flip side, and when I say flip, I don't mean like 180 always. Like there's remixing, there's scrambling, there's throwing things out. So it's just a turn of phrase, but there's many different ways to think about how these systems interact and what we can tweak, what we can get rid of, and what we can rebuild. So while I'm talking about travel and why people move in general and what these spaces are going to be used for, because we're all going to be moving a lot more. Some because we're forced to, some because they're privileged enough to have the choice. We also can segment, and I think Andrew touched on this a little bit. So why are people showing up to this city, right? Are they a family? And are they having children to educate? We need to look at signals on the horizon, whether they're weak or whether they're a bit further out, to understand how this is going to continue to shape tourism. For example, the Great Resignation in the United States. Many people are quitting their jobs. there's something called Blaxit, where lots of people do not want to live in the US anymore, and they are moving to other countries. I'm in groups on Facebook with thousands of people who are moving to other countries. So what is pulling people to those countries and pushing them out? What are they arriving with? What are they intending to do there? Because they may not be there for only a week or a month, but they're going to interact in these spaces with some elements of traditional tourist behaviors, maybe over a longer span of time, maybe not so fast and frenetically, because we have the capacity to do that now. What is remote work really going to change about what we think about tourism? People are going to travel, and because it's so expensive, and because it's such a huge investment and such a cost to the environment, they're not going to go away 4 times a year. Maybe they're going to go once, and they're going to go for 3 months. What are they? They're not an expat. They're not an immigrant because they don't plan to stay there forever. Are they a tourist? Yeah, sometimes, but they're also like digital nomad. Okay. People get special names because of where they come from and these assumptions and biases we hold about who should be moving around and why. Everybody on this earth has a right to go find somewhere where they can not just survive, but thrive. And we need to think about how we welcome people to different spaces and how we create environments that are multifunctional, multi-purpose, but also not permanent enough to impose our ideas of the future on the generations to come, because they should have a right to determine their futures as well. So we need to promise this earth is going to be here for them, right? But we also need to be careful not to assume that we know what they want, because we do not.
Well, that's a beautiful vision. And I really like the way you return there to the terminology, like what words we use or what labels we put on things or what titles we might apply to our own activities or dreams, what categories we set for ourselves and for others, shape the things that we do in physical space. And that relationship, not just between the digital idea of the virtual, but the psychological and the ideological idea of non-material flow of concepts, and how that has not a direct but a powerful influence on the things that we do as we go about the world in metric space. And in a way, attempting to connect these narratives or ideals or the principles and the ethical issues as Andrew's identified them to the concrete things that we do, I think is the crucial aspect of how theory relates to practice. So we've got a very rich dilemma here. I've pushed on the idea of the global carbon budget, the very important fact that the evidence shows we're running out of time. There isn't the space in the atmosphere to take the carbon that the demand under consumerism and capitalism is pushing for, means that at some point there's going to be real tension. We already have this double edge of movement where large numbers of people are traveling, and growing number are traveling for leisure purposes. And then there's also the forced displacement of people who are having to uproot and leave behind their homes and communities and try and make a better life for themselves elsewhere, motivated by a desire for survival. And so this contrast at the two opposite ends there, leisure and luxury and relaxation, spare time away from the working life, and then the bare need to survive, they exist as a kind of powerful set of opposites. But in between are all these other types of movement that people make, which have complex and multiple motives behind them. So I wonder, maybe Andrew, to turn to you again and try and see whether the ideals we have for sustainable tourism that you've sketched out for us could be realized. What are the practical steps we might take that would take us a little bit closer to aligning the ideals of sustainable tourism with the actual constraints and pressures that the science is showing us, and the actual experience of overcrowding, for example? What can we do to connect our principles and ethics with the practical challenges we face?
Yeah, I think we have to redress. I mean, one of the very interesting things about Sophia's talk and about futures. I mean, this is it's a big issue of the ethical side of sustainability. It's about future generations and about the legacy that we are leaving for them in terms of the natural environment and environmental resources. And so you take the example of a tourist destination that has a coral reef. I mean, the the whole industry, the livelihoods of people in that destination is built around the well-being of that reef. So it's absolutely essential that that is planned and managed and utilised, not just for the immediacy of what people want to get from it now, but to think about, you know, what will it bring to people 6 generations down the line, whether that's in tourism or just generally in the quality of their life, because as you know, the biodiversity of the coral reefs is second only to tropical rainforests, and it has an essential part in the functioning of the whole ecosystem of that area, not just purely for tourism. And it's that kind of thinking, and I think what Sophia was saying as well about our training. This is a big problem of our human ability, is to think into the future. We're very, very poor at it, it's a real issue about how we actually train our minds to be able to do that. I mean, when we were challenged by the pandemic, suddenly it seemed acceptable to have our mobility greatly restricted, because governments took the action to do that. But people understood that it was both in their individual interests, i.e. not to get ill themselves, but also in the collective interest of taking pressure off national health services not to travel. And certainly for a time, whilst there was that belief that that was the real positive outcomes of restricting our mobility, and that we were all doing it together, it seemed there was some coherence in society that this was actually an action that we were willing to take as individuals to curtail our mobility. So, and I've thought about the implications of this in terms of tourism and climate change. I mean, what are governments willing to take action about restricting people's mobility? Do they have a right to do that? Because, you know, in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, there is a right for people to travel for that mobility purposes. And it's a very interesting question. And of course, there are ways of dealing with that in different ways. So things like frequent flyer taxation, for example, because if you look at the amount of trips that are actually done, even though those figures I gave for flying were very, very high, it's actually a relatively small percentage of the world that are flying at the moment. It's very, very unequal between countries and even within countries. So you will find that when you look at the statistics, a very small percentage of people are actually flying globally, but what they are doing is flying frequently. And this raises issues then about, well, can you then introduce things like frequent flyer taxation to actually reduce the amount of travel that's being taken by certain people if it's providing beneficial benefits in terms of reducing GHG emissions and helping to mitigate climate change. But also there is the ethical issue about people asking themselves, you know, is it okay to fly 8-9 times a year when we know that this is actually contributing to climate change and is going to affect the well-being of future generations. But I think it's a very interesting one about what Sophia was talking about, people being able to project into the future and what kind of futures they want and what they want for future generations. And I think that's a big ethical issue of climate change, and certainly something like tourism, which is predominantly, you know, I know we need to redefine it, but a lot of it is around recreation. It's still recreational tourism is a big part of the market, and whether we can justify the sort of patterns that we have now. And certainly, obviously, if everyone was following the patterns that people, Western countries have been doing in terms of tourism, then it wouldn't be sustainable. You talk about the global carbon budget, and that would be a major issue. So it's a really big issue, and I think that's why I think about ethics as part of addressing this, ethical questions about the purpose of tourism, about the impacts of it. We talk about government coercion as another aspect of it into the future. And at destinations, I think we can do it. We can get sustainability at destination levels. I think there's great opportunities for architecture for art to influence that as well. I mean, art conveys messages, it conveys images, it conveys dreams, it can convey ethical aspects. And, you know, I see that mix of art and architecture also feeding into this quite heavily.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because what you've done there is talk about the fact that we do have many of the technologies needed. The finance does exist, even though it's not forthcoming. The skills, and in many cases, the vision is available. But I think the underlying narratives that people still have for themselves haven't perhaps assimilated the shock of the pandemic and what it's proved. People have recognized that the old narrative of business as usual, which is that everybody would continually become more wealthy, has hit a kind of limit here, and that it isn't possible under the circumstances we face. But the idea that futures, as practiced and promoted by Sophia, could help us form new stories for ourselves within which our sense of self gets altered. The process of development and personal growth is something that I think is deeply written into the idea of progress through life. But whether that can now take a new direction, and it can not simply treat the pandemic as a temporary disruption, but a real opportunity to rethink the narrative, that actually responding to adversity is part of that process of development and growth. We don't simply overcome the problem and move on and do what we were doing before. That idea that people might travel and leave the land they've traveled to unchanged was, I think, a very deep criticism of a certain mode of travel, if people simply go for rest and relaxation.
Can I just interject briefly that? I mean, one thing also is, I know in Wales, they have a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, you know, and this is quite significant. That's been passed in their parliament, and they have a commissioner for it as well. And I do think that this is, and the aim of that act is to actually govern decisions that are taken now. So to think that when a decision is made about what will that be on the future generations, not just on the next 5-10 years. And I think that's, you know, this is really important, these kinds of developments, in terms of changing the whole way we look at planning and sustainability in the future.
Well, you've touched on it there. I think this idea about personal growth as change over time. Maybe travel is change through moving through space. And that actually the pressures of contemporary life to compress things and indulge in sort of maximum productivity and maximum consumption, intense experiences. It might be that our sense of temporality and the pace of the narratives that we construct for ourselves change. One comment we have here is that we've discussed the aspect of longer travel times, that instead of jetting off for an intense weekend city break, people might travel for longer and move more slowly and stay for longer periods of time, as Sophia was saying. And could architecture, could the spaces we make for ourselves encourage and facilitate multiple modes of being rather than simply a short haul, quick visit? So this isn't something which is open equally to everybody. The commentator has said that it's difficult for people who have regular employment, but it's more accessible for the freelancer and perhaps creative or art workers. So perhaps, I don't know how that works out, but what do you think, Sophia? Do you think that there's any sectors of practice, such as creative architects and artists, who are more able to travel and stay in a diverse mix of patterns and modes of being? Rather than, say, somebody who's a business traveler who might have regular employment and a kind of more regular set of pressures?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to ask you, actually, because you're all still in academia, but I used to work as a university and careers counselor. And if we're looking at trends with how people are educated and think about the futures of work as we're seeing them from the disruptions of COVID, lots of different well, first of all, professions that are necessary don't even exist yet. So people are creating their own jobs, and people are able to work remotely. They were resistant to remote schooling, remote work, but yet, lo and behold, the pandemic came along, and suddenly we are all able to learn from a distance, and we're all able to work from a distance. So it's really about understanding and being able to pick up on different trends. So in futures, a simple way to think about this is we look at trends on the level of the political, the economic, the social, the technological, the legal, and the environmental. And then you have the sense make of all that, right? And you start to see things emerging from there. And with response to that question, lots more people, as we talk about personal growth and development, this pandemic forced a lot of people to really sit with themselves for the first time in a long time. And that was catastrophic in many ways for some people, because in this capitalist, in performing capitalism, you don't get to sit and be with yourself and confront things that are very difficult. Now, we're seeing in the political spheres and these ideologies and conspiracies, that's the easy way to kind of make sense of this very, very a confrontational and complex time, right? It's a different story. The meaning making is outsourced to something else, and there's never an end to it. And then on the other hand, there's sense making, and there's thinking about, well, how have I changed from this? And what do I want to live like going forward? A lot of us are hospicing modernity. We realize that in our lifetimes, things are just going to be very difficult, very difficult. So what do we do about that? How does that inform the decisions we make today, right? So in terms of who's going to be moving and what they're going to be doing for work, that remains to be seen. You have generational aspects to consider, and those ideologies and values that perpetuate. You have older generations who, now that they've got their retirement fund, they want to move to Bali and buy a piece of property. And then you have younger people, and these are the kinds of travelers actually that these nations are talking about wanting the most. They want people who are going to spend a lot of money, stay in their hotels, eat out every meal. But these are the people that leave the biggest carbon footprint. Whereas digital nomads are people who work from a laptop and stay for a longer time, tend to live more sustainable lives. They go shop in the local markets. They go buy, they live in shared accommodations and spend a longer time here for what, so the balance is just not there. So I hope I answered that question somewhat. If there's something I could further elaborate on, let me know. But
no, that's really helpful,
yeah.
Because I mean, the idea that somebody might have a short-term time frame and they're telling themselves a story like, I'm just going to get through this, I've worked really hard, and now I'm going to celebrate and take a short, intense city break. Whereas other people might say, okay, I've accumulated enough surplus wealth in my life and I want a comfortable retirement, and the best place I can do that would be somewhere gorgeous like Bali, so I'll go and buy a piece of property. So there's two examples there of narratives, one very short and compressed and one which takes a longer span. Both
and they can be generational.
Well, they're both centered around a kind of private individual, though. And what I liked about what you were saying was looking beyond the present generation into the rights and needs and aspirations of future generations. And that takes us outside this individualistic self, you know, which could be dated back to Cartesian dualism, or it could be centered in the capitalist consumer. But that we might look beyond our immediate desires and wishes and aspirations and start thinking about a bigger story that goes beyond ourselves. That was a lovely contribution. And the way that you opened up our thinking process beyond our own personal wishes and into those of future people who have yet to be born, I think raises this issue of intergenerational equity.
Yeah, intergenerational fairness is crucial, and something I'm also thinking about. We need to watch demographics and the shift in demographics in the various places and the countries, and how that impacts how people move and who's going to be working and what needs the cities have and what we build in them to accommodate. Something I'm thinking about a lot is that we all need to be thinking about in order to begin preparing for these futures, are that these young people, there's early trends showing that, like, students that are in preschool now, because they've been, because there's been so much mask wearing, they don't read lips. So there's been reports about delayed speech and communication skills. You know how you have benchmarks. So how is that going to impact how we educate them, and then the jobs they get, and then where they have to live because of those jobs they get? So it's thinking about the first order implications, second order implications of all of these things and how they impact each other, right? So those who were born in this time of pandemic, also generational theory says they're going to be the disillusioned ones, because we're looking at cycles in macro history as well. So are they going to, they could either want to travel because they're so disillusioned and they just don't want to tie down anywhere, or maybe they just decide to hunker down where they are and try to create a little bubble of happiness, right? How does that manifest? There's myriad ways it could all play out, right? So it's just about being flexible and thinking of the micro implications and the meta of this whole thing and how these trends interplay with each other.
Well, that kind of flexibility, the ability to move between the small scale particular example of a phenomenon, and then to reach out and cross disciplines and expand the time frame to connect it to something else in a way which might help anticipate things which otherwise will be a surprise or a disruption, I think is one of the characteristics that you've shown us through futures thinking. One question we have here is about does anybody have suggestions for guidelines in terms of carbon footprint, for example, of travel? And I think that touches on this idea of which things we look to measure or to calculate and judge. And carbon is obviously one of them. But if we look at a wider ecological footprint, for example, a whole range of indexes might come up which complicate our choices. And if you broaden it further still to include social factors, ethical questions such as have been outlined by Andrew, then we end up with a bewildering array of dilemmas. And I wonder whether as a futures practitioner, you've got any suggestions for methods or websites that might help us engage in this. Perhaps we need to take some training in futures thinking, or is there a source of information you would recommend?
I mean, futures literacy is something we are all innately born with. We just need to wield it. And there are tools and frameworks that I'm happy to share. Unbelievably, the panel I put together on the futures of tourism was the first ever at the Asia Pacific Futures Network Conference. And it was just like, what are we doing here? Why did this take so long for us to be talking about this in Asia, where this is such a generator of their economy and many, many people's livelihoods? So the intentional coming together of futurists and tourism professionals, human geography professionals, is just beginning. But I will say that I can share a few links. Mike McCallum is actually doing an amazing initiative called the Sustainable Benefits Tourism Initiative. Mm-hmm. You might see an example of that at the initiative, the Phuket Sandbox, right? So part of the problem is governments were opening their borders, closing their borders, opening their borders, closing their borders. So we're looking at how they might reopen and how they might begin to welcome visitors. Something we didn't even talk about today is vaccine inequity also. So, I mean, we can go on and on and on and down many different roads about how are we going to build tourism back or build travel back different. In terms of ethical tourism, Sustainable Benefits Tourism Initiative by Mike McCallum is something wonderful to look into. And I actually responded to that question. A friend of mine, Carmen, started the Green Stamp Travel Agency. So it's an organization that helps you to really think about eco-conscious travel and curates experiences for you. So this is about the futures of work as well. This is a topic that is at the top of minds. If I am a university and careers counselor, I might be advising my students that, well, how do you think you want to contribute to this issue? Do you want to build things? Do you want to help people figure out how to, are you an engineer or a chemist? Do you want to, like, there's many things that we can all be doing to contribute to the issue. And we should be thinking about just a little bit ahead about how we might pivot and further, make our efforts more intentional, both in profession, but also in our personal lives. So those are two areas, and I would just watch this space. I have tons of contacts in the tourism industry. Thankfully, after that panel, there's Tourism Geographies magazine, which is amazing. Dr. Joseph Cheer does phenomenal work there. He's at Wakayama University now in Japan, but he's Australian. And there's just so many incredible conversations about travel and tourism.
Okay,
and
well, that's
possible
fantastic.
path you can go down.
You've made some really constructive suggestions there, and I've made notes, but my handwriting's a little bit shaky. So if you wouldn't mind sharing maybe in the chat or afterwards, that would be really helpful. Mm-hmm. Well, Andrew, I'd like to come to you finally here and just ask whether, looking ahead, what you would see as the key influences on the emergence of the new tourism that you've sketched out for us. What might be the principal drivers? We've got constraints like economic downturn, maybe, or growing inequality and the pandemic. But then there's opportunities like new technologies developing and shifting attitudes and people beginning to ask the deep questions that Sophia's pointed us towards.
Yeah, thank you, David. I mean, I think one of the aspects is the dualism that between the urban places that we live in and the places we travel to. And, you know, there's a whole movement to create sustainable urban environments, and certainly improving the quality of the urban environment, I think, will have an aspect of where we travel to and how often we travel out of it. So I think that's an issue. It is about where we actually live, as much about as where we go to in terms of the future. The other aspects of it that I see in terms of the influences, certainly I would think that at some stage there's going to be some kind of government action, fiscal action on aviation, which will influence movements and patterns. I think the ethical re-questioning of tourism and the purposes of it as individuals, why we undertake it, what we want from it, I think that is happening. I think that will grow. I think the growth of niche tour operators like Sophia was talking about, rooted in destinations, rooted with local people, using indigenous knowledge, tuned into the environment, I think that will grow. I think people will gradually transform to more environmental aware lifestyles. We're already doing that. I mean, that's partly being pushed on us, it's partly people being aware of that themselves. Tourism will become more integrated into the consumer lifestyle that has a higher level of environmental orientation to it. So that's what I really see as the future. I think we're undergoing massive changes. The big questioning of our life after the pandemic, and the reflection that's taken place in that about what we want from it, where we do things. Work has come into the home so much more than it was 2 years ago through information technology. Shopping has, elements of consumerism have. How much of that can be brought in the case of tourism? What I said at the end of my presentation about artificial intelligence, robotics, how that will influence the home as a place to actually not be a tourist. Let's change that. To experience an environment in another place, and the authenticity of that, and how that will build onto tourism, replace it, is another issue. So I think there's so many sort of technological economic changes that are taking place, combined with the whole environmental picture, which is now integrating economy into it very, very heavily. That I think 20 years' time, we will have very different travel patterns. And the other aspect of this, of course, is a tremendous plurality of cultures that are going to be experiencing tourism. So we're going to have different cultural perspectives feeding into that global tourism market in a much heavier way, which is away from what has been a very Western-centric model. And I think though that will have an influence as well in the future about how tourism pans out and in its sustainability. So I think there are tremendous opportunities for, if we talk about environmental sustainability, for protection of nature through the use of tourism, by tourism giving it an economic value, seeing as a key resource. So we have to use the economic argument as the only way of conserving, then tourism is a route to that, because generally environment's always been pushed down in terms of development considerations above economic ones. And remodeling all our economic structures, moving away from GDP, rubbish, gross domestic product, old-fashioned, out of date, no environmental values included. I mean, we have to move away from those outdated economic growth models. And I think tourism in that kind of environment will be able to thrive in a way that actually makes a very positive contribution to a new green economy and towards sustainability.
That's really helpful. That's actually an impressive tour de force there of resistance to some of the negative trends and phenomena that I outlined at the beginning here, looking at the shared socioeconomic pathway of the rocky road where countries don't cooperate, which appears at the moment to be the direction that many countries are heading in. But what I think is wonderful about your analysis here of the opportunities ahead of us, if they're motivated, the way we respond to the opportunities is driven by our values and a will, in a way, way, based in ethical principles for something better to happen, then there's real possibility for something good to come out of that. But I think to make it coherent, going back to Sophia's position here about the narratives, the stories we tell ourselves and our position, the roles we play within those narratives, I think is something which isn't just an account of what got us to the situation we're in, but the kind of imaginings of the futures that we could actually carve out for ourselves or construct or cultivate out of the range of fragments we're presented with, which are otherwise just an incoherent mass. So making sense of the world, I think, is what we're talking about in a way. We may be speaking about the disciplines of art and architecture, the industry of tourism, but really, I think there's questions of identity and subjectivity and deep cultural transformation at stake here. We've been going quite a while now, though, and I'm very conscious of the time. I haven't seen so many questions in the chat, but it might be because my technological skills are still stuck in the 20th century. So if there are any questions to wrap up with, I'll be very happy to field those. Otherwise, I would say maybe, Sophia, if you've got any concluding comments that might give us an overview from your particular perspective. You're in Bali right now, as I understand it. And so that's a place I'd long to be in if I hadn't renounced air travel. So do tell me a summarizing point here from Bali.
Oh, this is a challenge, but I will say that we can all potentially agree that we are in late stage capitalism. We are approaching the end of the Anthropocene. We are increasingly and collectively more curious about more than human approaches to how we interact with each other and with the world around us. So I think that is really going to, that's already having an impact on how, on what people are thinking about travel. For example, you were way ahead of the game back in 2005, thinking about the environment. But I think as people expand beyond the Judeo-Christian, Western-centric worldviews that they have about our dominion over the earth, some of these things might right themselves, right? A greater appreciation of the symbiotic relationship that indigenous cultures and more animist cultures embody in the way that they live in the world. So maybe these are just emerging things that are going to help people to more position themselves in a way that considers the ethical considerations of travel. And also, technologically speaking, I mean, me personally, I was mentioning the other day in our conversation, I've been in Bali for a really long time. And there's very interesting dynamics here. I didn't want to go running around in a global pandemic, but the social scene here didn't really pause all that much. Yet I'm tired of a screen. I really miss going to in-person conferences. I miss going to school, sort of, not really, but it was a huge jump from working in a school to actually just being a digital nomad and like working by myself most days. So I'm not all that excited about the metaverse. And I'm sure you might be hearing this word used increasingly. But what does that mean for the ways that people might be able to travel? Like, I don't trust Mark Zuckerberg for anything, but if they're able to recreate the smells of, what's that place I went to in China, in Xi'an? Oh, Muslim Quarter in Xi'an, and like give you the taste and the feeling or the crisp air of the Alps. How can technology might have us traveling without really going anywhere. Before I ever set foot on a plane, I was reading a ton of books and that's how I traveled, right? So are we going to be, and is it going to be that appealing? I think so. I think so. People just like to spend money on things, and they're even willing to spend money on NFTs and things that don't really exist physically. So while that may seem ridiculous, because it seems absolutely ridiculous, it's a different way of consuming that is not so harmful for the environment. So I have to think, oh, it's not either or, maybe it's both and. Maybe that's not how I'll do it, but more power to you if you're going to contribute to us mitigating this damage that we've caused by sitting in your house and doing a VR experience of a beach in Thailand. I welcome it, right? So just keeping an open mind and being flexible about how people will move, how things will move, because maybe, I mean, art goes from city to city, right? So that can continue as well, or will it? I mean, maybe there's a way to simulate art experience. There are ways. Actually, during the pandemic, we saw museums opening up and inviting people in because they couldn't go there physically. So more of that, right? I think we just have to really let go of what experiences mean and how they're supposed to feel and make new meanings of them and not rely on other people and comparing ourselves to each other to make meaning of our experiences.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that. That's really inspiring. The idea that there's a state of mind which might inform the way that we think about ourselves and the choices that we face, and therefore the actions that we take, I think is really underlying this deep transformation that appears to have begun now. And it's been jolted by the pandemic, and there's new pathways forward with some of the emerging technologies. But I don't think we overall have a clear sense of a new direction to take. And the desire to return to the comfort and security of business as usual, I think is very powerful. And yet, nevertheless, as you were saying with the Great Resignation, and I think you used the word Blaxit, there's a trends are emerging which might prove to be very powerful if they operate in conjunction with each other. So that's really inspiring. I've learned an enormous amount from you and from you, Andrew, and Martha when she was able to be with us. And it's been a fantastic conversation. I'd really like to thank our hosts, Nicholas and Charlotte at Praxis, for bringing us together, because I don't think I would have met you otherwise. I might have stayed here in my particular bubble, but having reached out and connected, I hope we can stay in touch in the future. I've learned so much from you, and I've got so many questions which I'd like to pose to you at some point in the future, should the opportunity arise. But I'm going to pass back now to Nicholas, with massive thanks again for setting this up, Nicholas. You've done a great job.
Well, no, thank you to you, David, for doing such a fantastic job of steering the conversation so smoothly and in such interesting ways, and fantastic conversation. And so thank you to all of our panelists, to our collaborators, and to everyone who's joined us. Just quickly, like I said, I mean, it was really interesting for me thinking about the complexities of human behavior, and actually the kind of also the psychological side of that, which you touched upon, and how, you know, there really is a need for long-term thinking, long-term action. And I think most people recognize this. And at the same time, we're so tempted by short-term gains. You know, it's so easy to think, oh, well, you know, I'm just one person, it won't make any impact. Or, oh, but I'll just, you know, everyone else is doing it too, so I'll you know, pop it. But actually thinking about, you know, a greater emphasis on future thinking and having it more integrated even into schools or something like this could really affect our relationship to time, you know, and where we live and how we think about the responsibilities and ethics of what we're doing. I thought that was a very interesting takeaway for me. And I think, I mean, there was so much rich content that was touched on here that we kind of have multiple panels on various parts of what was discussed. But I mean, I think those books which maybe Martha summed up very succinctly in terms of kind of stewardship, regulation, education are really kind of key things. And Andrew, you also had so many like interesting points about what will happen. And I think one thing that maybe is so difficult to understand is actually how we will be working in the future. How will, you know, developments in technology and things like this actually affect, you know, what jobs there are and things like this. But anyway, so I'm left with a lot of questions as well, also about how architects and artists can influence these kind of things. It's just one, you know, we're sort of setting this background in order to kind of ask some of these broader questions as well. And I'm looking forward to continuing to unpack and to workshop these things through the project as it continues through next week's discussion, which I'd like to add takes a slightly different form from this one. We're inviting back the moderators, our audience as they've joined through, and also new members to have a more open discussion. So it won't be kind of panelists and the audience, hopefully all together, picking up on key points that have happened through these first talks, and we'll have a more open discussion. So I hope that those of you in the audience are able to join us for that. And also workshopping it as we continue into the next stages of the project that I described at the beginning. But yeah, so this has been really fantastic. Thank you all very much. And as those of you who would be interested in joining next time, if you want to sign up, you've managed to sign up for this one, so I expect you found out how, but through our website, the events section there on praxisoslo.org, you can register for next week's more open panel discussion. And also, we look to keep all of our events open and accessible to as many people as possible, but you can help us with the work that we're doing by supporting us on patreon.com/Praxis Oslo from as little as €1 a month, which just helps us, yeah, keep these things open and keep us going. But yeah, so with that little plug at the end, thank you all so much. And yeah, I look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Bye.